No such thing as European money, it's our money. We are a massive net contributor into this European Union for no single economic benefit in return whatsoever.
No.
It's our money.
Non posso replicare, non posso. Presidente Barroso.
President Barroso.
No, I usually do not intervene, but there is a point of order that I want to make. It is not the first time that Mr. Farage, addressing to myself, says, "You have not been elected." Certainly I have not been elected by you, but I have been elected by this Parliament. I have been elected in a secret vote by this Parliament, and you belong to this Parliament. I consider that always saying that myself or the Commission have not been elected is a lack of respect to the Commission and to the Parliament to which you belong.
Be a taxpayer.
Bene, vi prego di non continuare.
Please let's not continue with this.
Vi prego. Raccolgo la precisazione del Presidente.
Now, following what Mr. Barroso said, well, I thought that was a very fair comment, and I'll give the floor to Mr. Sousa Wagner for 2 minutes.
To find out more about who we are and what we stand for, go to the UK Independence Party website at www.ukip.org.
Every year, the UK contributes a huge amount of money into the European Union. How much? Well, just imagine I'm on my way to Brussels without payment for the year. This UK truck is full to bursting. £14 billion of taxpayers' money. OK, let's go.
Obviously, our friends across in France make a similar journey each year. When everyone gets to Brussels, their contributions are redistributed to fund all the EU activities throughout the Union. The UK, for example, takes back around £4 billion for various EU-funded projects, plus a rebate. More about that later.
So when we set off back to Blighty without EU cash, it requires a smaller truck. And there's Henri, with his rebates, back off to Paris. But he appears to be in the same truck as he arrived in. So what's going on there?
It appears Henri returns to France with 98% of his contributions, the bulk of which is destined for the French farmers as part of their common agricultural policy deal, because historically it's always been that way. This situation has continued for many years, and it's set to get worse. So far, the UK has contributed £300 billion, of which only £66 billion has been spent directly in the UK.
Kind of get screwed over, I guess, don't we? Spending that much money.
The government has been handed fines by the EU of somewhere in the region of £150 million for breaches including failing to fly the European flag or using EU logos where EU money has been involved. And it's not just the government that's fallen foul of EU rules. Organisations including the YMCA and the Birmingham Chamber of Commerce have been fined for the same misdemeanour. So what's the problem with hoisting the EU flag in the UK? Stephen Smith unfurls the story.
Nothing bland about the fines imposed by the EU on UK bodies which received European money but failed to show European insignia, including the flag. Advantage West Midlands, a regional development agency, was fined more than £200,000. The Birmingham Chamber of Commerce was fined over £77,000 and the YMCA in Peterborough over £1,000.
It's easy to make fun of it, isn't it? And to equate it with the so-called bent bananas and straight cucumbers, and both of them myths, of course. I don't think there's anything to say about it apart from maybe laughing it off and maybe not just concentrating on what seems to be a fairly incomprehensible decision. But rather, I think England, or the English, should rather question their own commitment to Europe and the way they feel about it and why they feel so differently from a number of continentals.
On Wembley Way this evening, as underperforming England prepared to meet Hungary, I wasn't sure how the St George's flag would go down, never mind the EU duster. Now, can you identify this one, this blue one I've got?
European one, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately?
Yeah.
Why'd you say that?
Well, not good for us, is it?
Is it not?
No.
But we're part of it.
Yeah, well, wish we weren't.
Can you identify these flags for me? I'm sure you can.
Yes.
Go on then.
That's the English flag.
And that one?
That's got to be Hungary.
Hungary?
Yeah.
Actually, it's the EU flag.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Right.
You don't recognise that?
No, I don't.
They're a bit upset that we don't fly this flag very much.
I think you need to keep a bit of your own individuality as well, though.
All right for golf, though, isn't it?
Ryder
Cup.
Yeah.
Right for golf.
Okay. Can you tell me what these flags are?
This is the St. Cross, and
Yeah.
this is the European Union flag.
Yeah. You don't see this one much here, do you? Have you noticed that?
Yes.
What do you think about that?
Because England doesn't like the European Union, I think that's why.
England doesn't like the European Union?
Maybe, that's why. Not really.
It's unfortunately a state of affairs that will carry on for a very long time, and actually I can't see an end to it.
It's interesting that you seem quite sad about this.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, very much so, because I love this country. As I said, I've lived here for nearly a quarter of a century now, and I think that England is really missing a trick here by not embracing European culture, well, Europe, full stop, much more than it does.
Back at the flag makers, they take the long view of history. It's one thing to run something up a flagpole, another to get people to salute it. It's early days for the EU colours.
Certainly the acceptance of an EU flag. It's 20, 30 years now, so it is started to get in. But it's got another 400 years to match the Union flag.
The Lisbon Treaty, which for a long time we have campaigned for a referendum on, that has now been signed by everyone, it's being implemented. It's no longer a treaty, it's now the law. So we can't have that referendum, and I think it's very important to level with the British public and to say directly to them, right, what are we going to do now? And above all, what I've been saying today is this will never happen again. We'll never allow a situation where our political leaders can sign up to a treaty, pass powers away from Britain to Europe, and not ask us, the people, first. That's what today is really about. So I've given a speech here at the St Stephen's Club in front of the press, talked to my own members of Parliament. Yesterday had a shadow cabinet about this issue. It's a very important issue for Britain, for the Conservative Party, and it matters that we get it right. And I think that's what we've done today.
What would you say to people who are sort of accusing you of breaking promises today?
Well, the promise was very clear. It was a promise to have a referendum on the treaty. That treaty no longer exists. It's gone. It's over. It's implemented. And I would dearly love that it still existed and we could have that referendum. We can't. The Europe we now are in has got the things the treaty suggested. It's going to have a president. It's going to have a foreign minister. I can't make those go away. A referendum couldn't make those go away, so it becomes meaningless. And when the world changes, you have to move on and explain why we now need a new policy, which is what we've done and what we always said we'd do. I always said, while that treaty is a treaty, we can hold that referendum. As soon as that changes, we then absolutely have to stand up and say what we do. I've done that at the first available opportunity in the most open and public way that I could. And I think people can really get hold of what I'm saying, which is never again should this happen. We're going to legislate in our Parliament so that our government can never again hand over powers to Brussels without asking us, the people, first.
some of the government ministers who'd been sent out to bat to say there was no actual bailout being requested. The dogs in the street knew that the IMF were in town. They knew that there was discussions ongoing. They knew that these technical discussions, as the government was saying, were almost certainly likely to result in some request or form of assistance. So the government made complete fools of themselves, to be honest, not by denying it, but by denying it in the manner they did, in the vociferous nature, and they further eroded what residual credibility they had left.
The Irish crisis today reached breaking point.
This is a peaceful demonstration!
At the gates of Ireland's Parliament, public anger spilled over as demonstrators tried to stage a sit-down protest. This may have been a political stunt, but there is genuine anger across the country as Ireland has gone from boom to bust in just 3 years. Ireland's need for a multi-billion euro rescue package has become more than an economic crisis. The Irish government is on the verge of collapse. The junior partner in the two-party coalition announced this afternoon it was pulling out.
But we have now reached a point where the Irish people need political certainty to take them beyond the coming 2 months. So we believe it is time to fix a date for a general election in the second half of January 2011.
Rumours swept Dublin that the Irish Prime Minister would resign, but tonight he refused to go. He said he wouldn't call an election until he was allowed to pass a new budget. He made it clear that he was still in charge.
Nobody has pushed me into anything. What I'm simply saying is that we are focused on an issue of great national importance. And I'm saying that the biggest statement of confidence that can be given by this country at this time is to pass this budget. And this budget is the context in which we're having discussions to ensure that we have the necessary funding going forward.
The Irish government is still negotiating how much money it's going to need from the IMF and the European Union. Ireland is also set to receive a direct loan from its closest neighbour, the UK. But in return, Ireland has to produce a series of radical cost-cutting budgets. 15 billion euros must be saved by 2014. 20,000 public sector jobs are expected to be cut. Taxes are expected to rise. Welfare payments will be reduced. Even the minimum wage is likely to go down. The Irish government is now set to pay the political price for running out of money. A general election is now inevitable. And according to the opinion polls, a change of government is almost certain. Whatever happens, Ireland's political crisis is likely to be resolved long before its economic crisis. That'll take years rather than months. Mark Simpson, BBC News, Dublin.
Hello everyone, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, our weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, a special focus on the International Monetary Fund. Is it fit for purpose? Well, they didn't think so in Turkey. Violent protests on the streets of Istanbul as the IMF held its annual meet. We'll look at whether recession-hit Turkey can actually live without the IMF. Also, the roots of the organisation. Has it lived up to its founding goals, or is it just a club for rich countries to dictate growth? And as the developing world takes its seat at the financial table, can the IMF adapt? Can it embrace reform in times of economic upheaval? So, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, one of those economic bodies you hear a lot about, but perhaps wonder, what do they actually do? Well, when this global economic crisis erupted, the IMF did a lot. Yes, we heard all about the big banks being bailed out, but it was the IMF who took the step to bail out entire countries, providing billions of dollars in aid. And believe me, those countries needed it. Many were on the brink of bankruptcy. Have a quick look at some of the IMF's recipients. Iceland needed $2.1 billion as its banks and currency collapse under the weight of billions of dollars of debt racked up by its financial institutions. Hungary got a $25 billion rescue package from a combination of the IMF, the European Union and the World Bank. And Romania as well, almost $19 billion to stabilise its stricken economy. Then there were two countries which needed assistance because of internal conflicts. The IMF loaned $7.6 billion to Pakistan so that could continue to import essential goods and help the government pay its debts. And Sri Lanka got $2.6 billion to help it through the financial crisis and rebuild its economy after 25 years of civil war. But outside of those extreme cases, nations are actually pretty reluctant to take loans from the IMF and, for that matter, from the World Bank because they don't like the harsh conditions attached. Many say adopting those policies only makes matters worse. Case in point, Turkey. It's avoided going cap in hand to the IMF this time, but over the last 50 years has been the recipient of billions of dollars in loans. Thing is, unemployment's climbing, the country's in recession, and now it's having to weigh up whether to borrow from the IMF again to ease the discomfort. Anita McNaught begins our special from Istanbul.
Rejecting the globalization of financial markets, Turkish protesters embrace the globalization of shoe throwing. The target was IMF chief Dominic Strauss-Kahn. Iraqi-style shoe throwing works here, even if some feel the IMF and the World Bank do not. Out on the streets, the shoes are off again. This teaches unions against the privatization of education, one of the policies they believe the World Bank and IMF promote. In the midst of the marches, our Turkish shoe thrower.
The IMF is a useful tool for the rich, but never for the poor.
Turkey's been something of a testing ground for IMF policies since 1961, taking out 19 loans, reworking the agreements 18 times. Many of these protesters feel that while the World Bank and the IMF have kept Turkey looking stable and on a fiscal track acceptable to foreign investors and foreign governments, the price the people of Turkey have paid for this has been far too high. One paying the price is unemployed metalworker Kazim Vatan. Laid off from his car parts factory 9 months ago, he still can't find a job. They're casualties of the global downturn. Official unemployment has doubled to nearly 15%.
I want the politicians to come and swap places with us. Let them experience our lives so they know what a struggle it is to survive.
A survey of Turkish households just released shows the Vatans are a typical case. Poor Turkish families are cutting back on food, medical care and school books, falling behind on power bills. But Turkey's boom period of growth for the past 8 years has given it one of the largest gaps between rich and poor in the world. Whatever the role of the IMF, it hasn't meant a safety net for Turkey's low-income workers. Professor Kozanolu's just written a book on the global economic crisis. He says the IMF and World Bank are concerned with policies, not people.
For them, after the development of a country, the improvement of the living standards of its people are not so important. What is important is that a country can pay back its foreign debt and that it shapes its economy in a neoliberal way.
But economist Deniz Gökçe, who was part of a privately funded advertising campaign to keep Turks spending to bolster the economy, says Turkey would be worse off without the IMF.
IMF provides the cheapest lending with the longest term, and it's not a financial institution which might run away one day.
The decision for Turkey now is whether to take another IMF loan to cushion the economic downturn.
Turkey is not desperate like it was in 99, 2001, or 94, or 1980, or 1960, okay? It's not desperate. We can survive without the loan, but it will take a longer time for the recovery, especially in terms of unemployment. So now, when you sign an IMF agreement, this is considered a political liability on the government. It implies that you couldn't solve your own problems. And the Turks have basically a nationalistic general point of view. The left and right, both of them are nationalistic, okay? And so on the elections to come 2 years down the line, having had an additional IMF agreement would be considered a weakness on the part of the current government.
Half the men in the Vatans district of Istanbul are unemployed. It's their youngsters' future they worry about the most. Anita McNaught, Al Jazeera, Istanbul.
The International Monetary Fund often makes the news because of those who hate what they say it represents, profiteering at the expense of the world's poorest.
We've had a huge concern, which is echoed by people around the developing world, that the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has imposed on developing countries a set of harmful economic policies that have really hurt the poor and the country's overall economies.
But since the global financial collapse a year ago, the IMF has returned to the headlines for another reason. It might yet be the savior of the world's economies.
Slightly over a year ago, before the current crisis, it was an institution in decline. And it's so interesting today that in the current crisis, it's positioning itself as a major actor in trying to help the globe out of this crisis.
In fact, it was economic chaos, the Great Depression, that brought hundreds of politicians and scholars to a mountain resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. Their solution, the IMF.
Designed to establish the economic foundations of peace on the bedrock of genuine international cooperation.
The mission was twofold: stabilize currency exchange rates and rebuild the international payments system. The IMF's tactics also twofold. Member nations pooled their cash and made loans to countries with huge debts. In order to get the loans, the borrower countries had to reform their fiscal policies. But the plan had flaws. The United States alone held veto power over key policies. Even today, the U.S.'s veto policy remains, and the 20 countries with the most invested in the IMF control more than 70% of the decision-making power, including who gets loans. That leaves 166 nations with very limited access to working capital, including some whose growth in recent years could entitle them to a larger share. Critics also attack the IMF for ignoring the human rights abuses in dozens of countries in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. It made loans to military juntas in Chile and Argentina, to the dictators in Africa, and to the apartheid government in South Africa.
A lot of the money in dictatorships ends up getting siphoned away from the public purpose to which it's ostensibly being loaned and into the bank accounts of dictators. Ultimately, usually, those dictators fall away, but the problem is the country is still obligated to pay back the loans.
And the IMF's insistence that governments sell off their valuables to raise cash and cut government spending came with a cost: a lack of adequate health care, education, and business investment in the affected countries.
And the IMF's response has always been that we didn't cause the problem. We're going in to help you. You caused the problem. We're trying to fix it, and sometimes you have to take this bitter medicine.
And in a throwback to the Depression of the 1930s, which of course was the when the IMF was created, there is now a massive imbalance between countries with savings and those in debt. And that, along with the U.S. mortgage crisis, has led to the current global recession. If there is an upside to the chaos, the IMF is now rethinking its demands for austerity and the way it helps troubled countries. The question now, can the IMF, a creation of the brightest political and economic minds of their time, find a way to reinvent itself and remain relevant? I'm Rosalind Jordan for Counting the Cost.
The International Monetary Fund has said it expects Britain's economy to shrink by 4.2% this year, exceeding the government's own estimate, and shows fractional growth in 2010. The fund says Britain needs a credible plan with specific measures like spending cuts to rein in ballooning deficits. Our economics correspondent Faisal Islam is in Washington, home to the IMF. Faisal.
On that phrase, specific measures, i.e. the detail of spending cuts, it's the sort of IMF speak you'd normally associate with their dealings with bankrupt developing countries. Well, we're not near there yet, obviously, with Britain, but this report is the most important external audit of the UK's economy, and the IMF sees some worrying signs, particularly in terms of public debt. They project that public debt's going to reach 87% of national output, and on the wider gross measure hits 100%. 100%, the level where credit ratings agencies, where economists and currency markets start to get a bit twitchy. Certainly when I spoke to the former chief economist of the IMF, he said that this report is a warning sign.
They're worrying numbers. Basically, the UK has moved itself from a reasonable fiscal position to a precarious fiscal position, a position in which if you took another shock, or if, say, the downturn in the global financial services sector proves worse than in the IMF's baseline, and what the UK government thinks, you're going to really struggle to get out of that one. So the lights are flashing orange, not red yet, but orange, and it's got to be dealt with.
And do you feel that this sort of pressure from the IMF has effect? Does it work?
In the UK, it can have effect because public opinion and the press pay a lot of attention to IMF statements. So that's one reason the UK government has often pushed back in the past, one reason the sensitivities with Gordon Brown in particular.
Well, the IMF found an inspection team here this week, or just a few weeks back. They don't come again till after next year. They say they want to see these cuts in the moment when growth begins. So Mr. Brown's got a pistol to his head.
Yeah, well, certainly the Conservatives have picked up on this, and George Osborne's issued a statement saying they could hardly have delivered a more damning verdict. Actually, it's a little more nuanced than that. There was some praise for the government for their actions to save the banking system, for want of a better phrase. But on the timing, the IMF was more with the suggestion that you talk about spending cuts now, as the Cabinet Secretary has suggested, but you actually want to enact them only when the recovery has got firm roots. But no room for complacency. Ajay Chopra, mission chief at the IMF, says the benefits of the doubt for the UK will not last forever. Government should not test the limits of markets' confidence. Central message from all of this, that the UK's public finances issue is stable for the moment, but it means that we're somewhat susceptible to any new shock. And as you heard at the top of the programme, swine flu may be it.
Faisal Islam in Washington.
If you want to see the economic downturn's impact on average Americans, look no further than Sacramento, California. The city's homeless rate is growing at an alarming rate as people who just a few months ago had decent jobs suddenly find themselves with no place to go. Here's NBC's Chris Jansing.
This is Sacramento in 2009, but take another look. These images, so hauntingly reminiscent of the iconic photos of the 1930s and the Great Depression. This is a modern-day shantytown along the railroad tracks for Sacramento's exploding homeless population.
This is the bottom of the barrel here. I don't think it can get any worse than this.
Jim's new home, a small tent with 6 layers of tarp to keep out the rain. For 30 years he worked construction, then 6 months ago, the jobs dried up.
I'm used to having a roof over my head, electricity, my own bathroom, a TV to watch news. It wasn't even in my wildest dreams to end up in a place like this.
There are 2,000 homeless in Sacramento. 300 live here, with more coming every day.
I normally go to anywhere from 2 to 5 construction establishments or businesses a week, and I'm told the same thing every time I go to each one of them, that we're not hiring.
Many of the stories here are heartbreakingly similar. Middle-class Americans living paycheck to paycheck lose their job, then their house, and have nowhere to go. Every shelter in Sacramento is filled to overflowing. It's happening in Seattle, too. Tent cities in Reno and Nashville. Sudden homelessness brought on by unexpected, shocking poverty. Had you ever been homeless before this?
No, never even thought about it.
Before Corvin and Tina landed here just a few months ago, he made a good living selling cars.
It's pretty devastating to suddenly move into a tent, and you have to learn a lot of new things. It's kind of like being in the frontier days, you know, everything is hard.
Even with 6 blankets on their mattress, some nights are still cold. Bathrooms and a shower are at least a mile away.
The irony of it, I mean, you know, some of the people are homeless. I went to high school, you know, with...
The new mayor, former NBA star Kevin Johnson, grew up in Sacramento.
And I think really what has happened is this has been a dirty little secret, and we've kind of swept it under the rug.
Dinner is simmering in a pot made out of a coffee can. Soup from water, potatoes, onions, canned tomatoes. You're left to wonder what tomorrow will hold for the people here, and how many more will arrive.
For Today, Chris Jansing, NBC News, Sacramento.